Hey guys, Dr. Israel here for presentation number 8, our very last section in exercise physiology, and talking about the cardiovascular system. Now, I'm really going to breeze through this stuff and kind of just say a little bit about some of the slides, because a lot of the stuff you just kind of have to look at, understand the numbers, understand the systems, and it's really not very complicated. Not as many concepts in here as there are just facts, so we're just going to roll through the concepts as best as we can, probably just about a 10-minute video here. So let's get started. Oops. There we go. All right. So, in general, the cardiovascular system is involving 3 components. A pump, which is the heart, a system of channels, which is the heart, and the blood vessels, and of course a fluid medium, which in our case is blood. All right? And as long as you understand those 3 components, everything else is quite simple, it's just details. Now, the right side of the heart is known as the pulmonary circuit. It's part of the pulmonary circuit because the right side of the heart takes blood, shoots it over to the lungs take the carbon dioxide out of that blood, put oxygen into it, and comes back to the left side. The left side is the systemic circuit, or the systemic side. It takes blood and through the left ventricle, which is the biggest part of the heart, really powerful. The left ventricle has to contract and push blood all the way out of the heart to the rest of the body. Then it comes back into the right side and gets shuttled back into the lungs. All right. So, a variety of blood vessels accomplish this whole sort of act of pushing blood through the body. We have the aorta, which is the largest vessel in the entire body, and then we have vessels of smaller and smaller sizes. Now, on the side of the systemic circuit, or pushing oxygenated blood into the body, we have arteries that branch off into arterioles, that branch off into capillaries, where actual gas exchange with the muscles and all the other body structures occurs. The capillaries are no longer just for transport, they actually move nutrients to and from inside and outside the blood. Once we get out of the capillaries, venules collect all that pooled blood, it gets into veins, and then the vena cava sends it all the way back into the heart. So these are all different sizes, from largest to smallest, back to largest again. The cardiac cycle has 2 distinct components. Relaxation, which is known as diastole, it's the filling of blood into the heart, and it lasts about 2/3 of the time. And 1/3 of the time or so, we have systole, which is the contraction in the injection of blood out from the heart into the rest of the system. All right? And this is accomplished through the muscle of the heart. So the ventricles and the atria are actually all one lined muscle. It's all connected through what are called intercalated discs. So when one part of the heart contracts, the rest of the heart contracts shortly thereafter. So it works as one fluid pump. And let me show you guys exactly in what order it works. So here's this pretty good diagram here. The SA node is where the signal to contract really kind of starts. And the heart starts to contract. So essentially the signal hits the SA node, gets into the AV node, goes all the way down the AV bundle, or the bundle of His as it's also called, goes through the bundle branches and then into the Purkinje fibers. So essentially the Purkinje fibers start to contract the heart at the bottom, and because the heart contracts from the bottom up, this forms a squeezing motion of the heart. So the heart doesn't just lump the blood in on itself, because if you take a water balloon and just smush it together, the water doesn't really go anywhere in particular, but the heart contracts in such a way due to this arrangement that blood starts at the bottom and gets pooled up to the top and exits all the right valves at the right times. All right? So there's actually an order to this process. We're going to skip all the details on that. Heart rate is controlled primarily by the nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system gives the heart vagal tone through the vagus nerve. It actually reduces the heart rate and the contractility of the heart and the stroke volume of each contraction, the amount of blood in each beat. On the other hand, the sympathetic nervous system, through a variety of ways, makes the heart beat faster and contract harder each time to get more blood out. So during exercise, your sympathetic nervous system is activated and allows your heart to perform its function of getting blood around. And during recovery and rest, the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant, so your heart rate is very high and not a whole lot happens with high levels of blood flow. Normal resting heart rate for most people is about between 60 and 85 beats per minute. All right, so the stroke volume is actually pretty simple to calculate. It's the amount of blood pumped per contraction during systole. How much blood you get with each single beat. There's a process to calculate that we'll talk about in class. The cardiac output is really quite simple. The symbol for a cardiac output, you got to remember this is Q. It's really simple. How much of blood you pump for each beat, which is stroke volume, multiplied by heart rate, which is the number of beats per minute. So if your heart beats a ton of blood each single time and pushes out a lot of blood, it has a high stroke volume, and you get up to your maximal heart rate, so the heart rate's really high, your cardiac output is going to be the highest possible. So when you're doing really vigorous exercise and your cardiac output needs to be as high as it possibly can, we know there's two ways to get there. One, your heart has to be beating really hard. So if you've ever done a really hard exercise, you can put your hand on the left side right underneath your chest, and you can feel your heart go boom, boom, boom. It's contracting really hard, a ton of stroke volume for each beat. And if the exercise is super duper hard, your heart rate will also be really, really, really high. So through that combination, we get the maximum cardiac output, or the amount of blood circulating, to the highest it can be. Oops. All right. The vascular system plays an important role, of course, in transporting this blood. The capillaries actually undergo nutrient exchange. Interestingly enough, the veins, particularly the veins in the legs, store a lot of blood for later. A lot of your blood right now, if you're watching this and not exercising, if you're simply resting, most of your blood is sitting in the veins, it's being circulated around, but it's being pooled in your veins to a large extent. If you try to stand up for a very long time and not contract any of your leg muscles, so much blood can pool in your veins you actually pass out. It's called postural hypotension. It happens very, very rarely. But most of the time this doesn't happen. When you start exercising, one way to get that blood out of your veins and towards the rest of your system fast is because when you're exercising, your calves are contracting, your quads are contracting. Veins have one-way valves. If you press on them, the blood shoots in both directions, but because it's a one-way valve, it can only go up one, and all that blood starts to return to the heart. That's called the skeletal muscle pump, and it's very important for getting blood back into the heart when we need it. Now, as far as blood distribution is concerned, at rest, a lot of your blood goes to your brain, and a lot of it goes to your core organs, your heart, your liver, etc., and not a ton of it goes into your muscles and your skin, because you're not using them. Once you start exercising, the more vigorously you start exercising, first of all, the total amount of blood circulating goes up because we take blood from our veins, and those giant reservoirs, and we put them into general circulation again. So the blood amount goes up, but not just that. The amount of blood going to your heart and your lungs and everything else stays about the same. But the amount of blood that goes into the muscles multiplies many-fold, so that in reality, when you start exercising, your blood starts to circulate really, really fast to your muscles. Why? Because it has to get nutrients to your muscles, particularly oxygen, and it has to get waste products out. So when you start exercising, the harder you exercise, the more blood circulates, and the higher proportion of blood circulates to your muscles. And we have a pretty cool chart down the line for that. All right. Where is that chart? All right, so a couple of things before we get to showing you how that works. We have just some stuff on blood pressure. There's a concept called mean arterial pressure. It's essentially the average of your systolic and diastolic blood pressure, but it factors in the fact that diastolic blood pressure is most of what you experience because diastole lasts longer. Your mean arterial blood pressure is kind of like your average blood pressure. And of course, vessel constriction increases blood pressure, and if your vessels are dilated, your blood pressure goes down. As far as blood composition, blood is composed of essentially two large fractions: plasma, which is kind of the liquid component of your blood, and the formed elements, most of which are the hematocrit, or red blood cells. Females, or males generally have more hemoglobin and thus more oxygen carrying capacity. They have more red blood cells, mostly due to testosterone. Females have a bit less. Generally speaking, the more red blood cells you have, the better, up till about 60%. After that, the chances of a random blood clot happening are really high. Your blood gets so viscous it actually gets dangerous, and you don't want to go that far. Some endurance athletes that have used drugs in order to get their red blood cell count really high, sometimes they'll just die randomly in the middle of the night because their blood gets so viscous, it just forms a blood clot, and that's the end of it, all right? So some details on red blood cells, we'll cover the stuff in class. Hemoglobin, of course, is inside each red blood cell. It uses an iron attractor to transport oxygen. Hemoglobin transports oxygen many-fold times better than just plain old blood. So hemoglobin is essential to oxygen transport and actually to carbon dioxide transport as well. And this is, of course, on blood viscosity. We just talked about that. All right, so let's see what I want to say about that. Yeah, resting heart rate, average of 60 to 80 beats per minute. All right, tends to increase with age and increased cardiovascular fitness. There are people who are so good at endurance sport, their stroke volumes are so high per beat because their hearts are so large and strong and advanced that they are in the 30s in the resting heart rate. That means once every 2 seconds or so their heart beats, which is really, really low. People who tend to be in worse shape, people who tend to be more obese, their heart rates tend to be higher than 80 beats per minute. If your heart rate's higher, resting heart rate, than 100 beats per minute, probably means you're in very poor health. If it's lower than 60, that probably means you're in really good health. All other things being equal. Maximum heartbeat, very important concept. Humans have a maximum heart rate of about 220 beats per minute, and they hit that when they're 0 years old. So toddlers have a max heart rate of about 220 beats per minute. Heart rate falls by about a beat per minute every year after that. So 220 minus your age in years is how you calculate max heart rate. So 20-year-olds have an average max heart rate of about 200 beats per minute. 40-year-olds have about a max of 180. Now, there's a pretty big standard deviation there. Just over 10 beats per minute is one standard deviation. So a lot of people have a max heart rate at age 20 of 190, and a lot of people have a max heart rate of 210. Very few people have a max heart rate of 220 and above when they're 20 years old, because that's already more than 2 standard deviations out. So most people, a good estimate, 220 minus age is where most people's max heart rate is going to be. Here's the thing about max heart rate. It doesn't really change with training. Your max heart rate almost never goes up, never goes down. It's almost entirely determined by age. All right. Stroke volume, however, does change. Stroke volume largely depends on the shape of your heart, and if it's hypertrophy to an adequate extent, or is the heart muscle strong, as you train in endurance sport, your stroke volume goes up, which means that per the same heart rate, because heart rate's maxed out, you can pump more blood. Endurance athletes can get more blood flowing past the muscles. That means they get more oxygen to the muscles, more waste out, and they can be better at endurance sport. Cardiac output, aha, there we go. Here's our super important graph. So here's a graph of relative cardiac output during exercise. So rest, light exercise, heavy, and maximal. I want you to take a look at this blue section of the chart. That's muscle. Muscle, as you can tell, eats up more and more and more relative amount of blood during harder and harder and harder exercise. So when you're at rest, muscle gets just about the same amount of blood as everything else. The harder your exercise is, most of your blood flow starts going to the muscle, which is important because that's where all the action is. Now, this is relative. It's on a percent scale. Let's look at what happens in absolute, actually measuring blood flow in liters per minute or something like that. Boom. At rest, this tiny little fraction of blood goes in your muscle. Most of your blood is sitting in your veins. At maximal exercise, almost all of your blood goes into your muscles, and all liver and kidneys and everything else and skin gets very little blood flow whatsoever. So maximal exercise, hey, your body knows what it's doing. Most of your blood is going to your muscles to get oxygen in and to get waste out, plain and simple. All right, blood pressure changes during exercise. During cardiovascular exercise, your systolic blood pressure increases in proportion to the intensity, goes all the way up to a high level of blood pressure. If you're going maximally, your diastolic shouldn't really change. If your diastolic pressure goes up a lot during maximal endurance exercise, it's probably abnormal and it doesn't mean anything good. On the other hand, in resistance exercise, especially if you're squatting a ton of weight, the systolic and diastolic blood pressure can get up to 480 over 350 millimeters of mercury. That's crazy. It's actually not dangerous. If you're healthy, it's not a problem. And it could be actually beneficial in the long term, but it's expected that during resistance exercise, during the actual lifting, your blood pressure can go really, really, really high. Now, our last concept for today, I believe, is cardiovascular drift. Here's the concept of cardiovascular drift. You take one person, you put them on a treadmill, have them run at a steady state for an hour. And what tends to happen is they start at steady state with a certain heart rate, and you think, okay, you know, they're 120 beats per minute, they'll be just fine. After 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, their heart rate steadily goes up, even though they don't seem to be working any harder. The treadmill is going the same speed the whole time. So how come their heart rate's going up? Well, cardiovascular drift results from dehydration. As the person runs, they lose body water. Let's say we're not letting them drink any water. So they start at a certain heart rate because they have a certain amount of blood volume, and they need to circulate that blood past the muscles at a certain rate. Okay, fine. So they have a certain amount of blood, they need to get to the muscles at a certain rate, the heart beats at a certain rate, and we have a certain stroke volume. Now what happens with dehydration? The total amount of blood starts to go down. Each stroke volume starts to go down. So now our body, in order to get the same amount of blood, needs to compensate by increasing the heart rate. So cardiovascular drift occurs due to dehydration. The body increases heart rate to make up for it. How do you prevent cardiovascular drift from happening? You stay hydrated. If you stay hydrated during a race, your heart rate stays lower and you're capable of exerting yourself for much longer. That's all I have. As a matter of fact, that's all I have for the semester. Good luck on your quizzes and final. And at this point, I'll see you never again. Just kidding.